Close your eyes, feel the weight of your body settle, let the present moment fade away. Now, step backward through time. Not years, not centuries, but thousands of years. Keep going, further, deeper into the past. Millions of years dissolve like mist. You are standing somewhere you have never been, somewhere no modern human has stood in living memory. Open your eyes. You are on the sun-baked floodplain of what will one day become the American West. The year is approximately 152 million years ago. The heat hits you first. It is a dry, oppressive 38 degrees Celsius, radiating from the cracked earth beneath your feet. The air tastes of dust and ancient conifers. There is no grass here, only ferns, cycads, and the towering shadows of trees that have not existed for eons. And there is silence. A heavy, predatory silence that presses against your ears. Then the ground vibrates. Not an earthquake. A footstep. Emerging from the shadow of a tree line is a creature that defies logic. It is 9 meters long from snout to tail tip. It weighs 2,000 kilograms, equivalent to a modern bull elephant, but built purely to kill. Its skin is a mosaic of pebbled scales, painted in the dusty ochres and muted greens of the dry season. It moves with a terrifying bird-like grace. This is not a sluggish lizard dragging its belly. This is a precision instrument of evolution. It turns its head. The eyes are set forward, locking onto movement with binocular focus. Above them, 2 distinctive bony ridges flare up like horns, giving it a perpetual look of focused aggression. But it is the jaw that freezes your blood. The mouth hangs slightly open, revealing serrated blades of calcium phosphate. Each tooth is 12 centimeters long, recurved like a saber, designed not just to crush, but to slice through flesh and bone with surgical efficiency. This is Allosaurus, the lion of the Jurassic, the most abundant, successful, and terrifying predator of its age. Watch as it stalks. It is hunting something far larger than itself. In the distance, a herd of sauropods, long-necked giants weighing 30 tons or more, moves like a slow-motion thunderstorm across the plain. The Allosaurus does not run yet. It waits, it calculates. Its brain, though small by mammalian standards, is wired for one purpose: complex spatial mapping of a 3-dimensional kill zone. Suddenly, it strikes. The acceleration is shocking. From a standstill, 2,000 kilograms of muscle launches forward, covering ground at 30 kilometers per hour. It opens its jaws impossibly wide, almost 80 degrees, and slams its upper jaw down like a hatchet. The impact is visceral. Dust clouds explode, the roar of the prey shakes the ground, and in seconds, it is over. The silence returns, heavier than before. This scene played out millions of times over 10 million years. From the floodplains of Utah to the coasts of Portugal, this creature reigned supreme. It outlasted dynasties. It saw the rise and fall of other species. It was the definition of an apex predator. But here is the question that has haunted paleontologists for over a century. How did a creature this perfectly engineered for destruction, a predator so dominant it claimed nearly 3/4 of every large carnivore niche in its entire ecosystem, how did it exist at all in a world already ruled by giants? If you enjoy journeys like this one, consider subscribing. There's much more waiting for you. To understand the Allosaurus, we must first understand how we found it. The story of its discovery is as chaotic and violent as the world it lived in, rooted not in quiet museum corridors, but in the brutal dust and heat of the American West in the final decades of the 19th century. It is a story of ambition, obsession, and petty human rivalry that, paradoxically, produced some of the greatest scientific discoveries of the age. To follow the bones of Allosaurus, we must first follow the men who found them. The year was 1877. In the Red Desert Badlands of Colorado, a rancher named Arthur Lakes struck fossilized bone in an eroded canyon near Morrison. He wrote to two men, unknowingly lighting the fuse of the Bone Wars. On one side, Othniel Charles Marsh, a Yale professor of imposing intellect and imperial arrogance. On the other, Edward Drinker Cope, a Philadelphia naturalist of volcanic energy and genuine genius, whose professional relationship with Marsh had long since curdled into one of the most celebrated feuds in scientific history. Their war was conducted through proxy armies of hired prospectors, bribed informants, and deliberate sabotage. Dynamited quarries, stolen crates, forged letters, the papers rushed to print riddled with errors purely to claim priority. It was science conducted with the ethics of a gold rush, and it left the academic community in smoldering wreckage for decades. But in the chaos, the Earth gave up its treasures. But in the chaos of this rivalry, the Earth gave up its treasures. It was Marsh who first described the creature that would become known as Allosaurus. In 1877, working from fragmentary vertebrae sent from Colorado and material collected from Como Bluff, Wyoming, Marsh recognized something anatomically unique. The vertebrae were unlike anything he had catalogued before. They were hollowed out, air-filled, pneumatized, far lighter than the solid bone of other large predators. He named the creature Allosaurus fragilis in 1877, drawing from the Greek roots allos, meaning different, and sauros, meaning lizard. The different lizard. It was, in retrospect, an understatement so profound it borders on comedy. But the name endured and the science began. In the decades following Marsh's initial description, expeditions to the Morrison Formation, that vast geological canvas of sedimentary rock stretching across 1.5 million square kilometers of Wyoming, Colorado, Utah, South Dakota, Montana, Oklahoma, and New Mexico, continued to reveal the astonishing abundance of Allosaurus remains. This was not a rare apex predator, a scarce phantom glimpsed only in fragments. This was an animal of extraordinary numerical success. Where the sediments were right, where the ancient river channels had deposited their loads of silt and organic debris over millions of years, Allosaurus bones emerged in profusion. The Morrison Formation itself is a geological wonder, laid down between approximately 156 and 145 million years ago. Its sediments a palette of red, green, gray, and cream, each layer encoding a chapter of changing climates and rising water tables. It represents the fossilized remnants of a vast semi-arid floodplain, not unlike the modern Serengeti in ecological logic, but unimaginably different in the scale of its inhabitants. In these sediments, the bones of the Jurassic were locked away, preserved for an eternity, waiting. No site in the Morrison Formation has yielded more Allosaurus material than the Cleveland-Lloyd Dinosaur Quarry in Emery County, Utah. First formally excavated in the 1920s and 1930s and systematically studied since the 1960s, the quarry covers an area of approximately 0.4 hectares, barely larger than a modern football field. And yet, from this tiny patch of grey claystone, scientists have extracted over 10,000 individual bones. They represent at least 46 individual Allosaurus animals, ranging from small juveniles whose bones were still forming to massive, scarred adults who had survived decades of brutal conflict. The quarry also contains the remains of Stegosaurus, Camarasaurus, Diplodocus, and Barosaurus, among others, but Allosaurus bones make up approximately 67% of the total, an anomalous, even shocking inversion of the normal predator-to-prey ratio expected in any functioning ecosystem. The classification of Allosaurus has evolved as the science has deepened. For much of the 20th century, Allosaurus fragilis was treated as the single representative species of the genus, with various specimens assigned to it despite considerable anatomical variation. But the application of modern phylogenetic methods, the rigorous computer-assisted analysis of morphological characters across hundreds of individual specimens, has revealed a more complex picture. In 2020, paleontologists Daniel Chur and Mark Lowen published a landmark study formally describing a second North American species, Allosaurus jimmidseni. This species, named in honor of Utah State paleontologist James Madsen Jr., appeared to predate a fragilis in the fossil record, by extending the genus's known tenure in North America back another 5 million years and demonstrating that the Allosaurus lineage had been diversifying and experimenting with its body plan over a far longer evolutionary trajectory than previously appreciated. To understand why Allosaurus was so successful, we must study its anatomy with the care it deserves. The skull is the centerpiece, a structure of breathtaking evolutionary elegance. It measures approximately 1 meter in length in fully grown adults, a significant size, but what is remarkable is not its length but its architecture. The skull of Allosaurus is riddled with large openings, or fenestrae, that reduce its mass dramatically. There are 2 large antorbital fenestrae in front of the eye sockets, broad oval windows in the bone, as well as openings in the lower jaw. Together, these fenestrae reduce the total weight of the skull by approximately 40% compared to a solid bone skull of equivalent size. The result is a weapon that is simultaneously large enough to deliver devastating blows and light enough to swing at speed. The teeth of Allosaurus are engineering marvels in their own right. Each tooth is a blade, laterally compressed, recurved slightly backward toward the throat, and bearing fine serrations along both the front and rear edges, like the teeth of a steak knife magnified to a terrifying scale. Fully erupted teeth measured between 7 and 10 centimeters in length. They were not designed to hold prey or crush bone, they were designed to slice. Each tooth was also continually replaced throughout the animal's lifetime, as in all theropod dinosaurs, shedding worn or broken teeth and growing new ones in a conveyor belt replacement system. Shed teeth are among the most commonly recovered fossils associated with Allosaurus kills, found embedded in the bones of prey animals or scattered on the ancient forest floors where feeding had occurred. It was the maverick paleontologist Dr. Robert Bakker who proposed the most influential theory of Allosaurus hunting behavior in the 1990s, the so-called hatchet attack hypothesis. Bakker, whose career had been defined by challenging orthodoxy, most famously by arguing that dinosaurs were warm-blooded, active animals rather than sluggish reptiles, observed that the skull of Allosaurus was built to withstand enormous vertical stress along its length, but was relatively fragile against lateral twisting forces. This suggested that the animal did not attempt to hold struggling prey with its jaws, as a crocodilian does. Instead, Bakker argued it used the extraordinary musculature of its neck, which biomechanical modeling has since confirmed was disproportionately powerful, to drive its upper jaw downward with extreme force, embedding the serrated teeth in flesh and ripping them free, causing massive lacerations and catastrophic blood loss. The strategy was slash and withdraw, inflict the wound, let the prey weaken, attack again. It was a method of killing that prioritized the predator's survival as much as the prey's death. The estimated bite force of Allosaurus stands at approximately 8,000 newtons, considerably less than a saltwater crocodile's 16,000 newtons and far below the bone-crushing 35,000 to 57,000 newtons that Tyrannosaurus would eventually achieve. Allosaurus was not a crusher. It was not built for bone. It was built for cutting, for bleeding, for the patient art of wearing down creatures many times its own mass through repeated slashing contact and strategic withdrawal. The forelimbs of Allosaurus were large, well-muscled, and tipped with 3 recurved claws, the innermost thumb claw measuring up to 15 centimeters. Where Tyrannosaurus would eventually reduce its arms to near vestigial stumps, Allosaurus retained active grappling instruments, used to seize struggling prey while the jaws delivered their slashing blows and to rake across the flanks of fleeing animals. They made the difference between a predator limited to instant kills and one capable of engaging prey of varied sizes with patient, controlled violence. The sensory profile of Allosaurus was dominated by smell. Endocast analysis reveals disproportionately large olfactory bulbs, the brain regions processing scent, suggesting that the chemical landscape of the Morrison was Allosaurus's primary map of the world. It could detect blood across kilometers, identify individual prey animals by the stress hormones and metabolic compounds they exhaled, and track herds through dense forest cover long before visual contact. The vision supplemented this olfactory intelligence. The eyes were positioned for a binocular overlap of approximately 20 degrees, modest by mammalian standards but sufficient for distance judgment at the critical moment of an attack. And their large orbital size implies possible activity in low light conditions, extending the hunting window into the cooler, potentially more productive hours of dawn and dusk. The question of how fast Allosaurus moved has been approached through multiple independent lines of evidence. Trackway analysis, the study of fossilized footprints preserved in ancient sediments, provides the most direct evidence of locomotion speed. Allosaurus trackways have been found at multiple Morrison Formation sites, chads, and measurement of stride length combined with biomechanical modeling of leg length yields estimated walking speeds of approximately 8 to 10 kilometers per hour and estimated running speeds of 19 to 21 kilometers per hour. These are not the supernatural velocities of science fiction, but they are more than sufficient for an ambush predator. In the confined terrain of a Jurassic floodplain valley, a burst of 19 kilometers per hour from a creature of 2,000 kilograms emerging without warning from dense riverbank vegetation would have been a catastrophic event for any prey animal caught in its path. Among the most revealing Allosaurus specimens ever found is Big Al, MO 693, discovered in 1991 in the Howe Stevens Quarry of Bighorn County, Wyoming. Approximately 95% complete and measuring 7.5 meters, Big Al was a subadult who had not yet reached full size at death. His bones told a chronicle of suffering, 19 separate pathologies, including healed fractures of at least 3 ribs and a severely infected metatarsal bone in his left foot, a mass of chronic osteomyelitis that would have been agonizing and progressive, gradually destroying his ability to hunt with the speed and precision his life required. His death, likely from starvation following injury-induced hunting failure, possibly beside a shrinking Jurassic waterhole, was not the death of a triumphant apex predator. It was the death of an animal that had pushed its body to its absolute limit and could not push any further. The growth patterns of Allosaurus, revealed by bone histology, the microscopic examination of thin cross-sections of fossil bone, tell us something fundamental about their physiology. The femur bones of Allosaurus, when cut and examined under polarized light, show a dense, fast-growing bone tissue called fibrolamellar bone, characterized by a woven, disorganized matrix laid down at high speed. This is the same type of bone tissue found in modern birds and mammals during periods of rapid juvenile growth. It is not found in cold-blooded reptiles such as modern lizards and crocodilians, which grow slowly and produce a more orderly lamellar bone tissue. The presence of fibrolamellar bone in Allosaurus strongly implies a high metabolic rate, consistent with at least partial endothermy, the ability to generate and regulate internal body heat. As an Allosaurus grew from a roughly 10-kilogram hatchling to a 2,000-kilogram adult in approximately 15 to 18 years, a growth trajectory that is simply impossible to sustain without a metabolic engine running at mammalian or avian levels. The geographic distribution of Allosaurus and its close relatives reveals how deeply this body plan was embedded in the late Jurassic world. While the Morrison Formation provides the densest concentration of material, the Allosaurid lineage was not restricted to North America. In Portugal, in the rock units of the Lourinhã Formation, deposited contemporaneously with the Morrison and representing the margin of the same late Jurassic supercontinent, bones referable to Allosaurus or very closely related forms have been recovered. suggesting that land connections between Europe and North America still existed during this period, allowing faunal exchange across what would eventually become the North Atlantic Ocean. In Tanzania, at the world-famous Tendaguru Formation, another late Jurassic deposit of extraordinary richness. Theropod material assigned to a closely related allosaurid, Veterupristisaurus milleri, hints at a similarly successful body plan deployed in the southern hemisphere. For tens of millions of years across multiple continents, some version of the allosaurid hunter stalked the great sauropod herds of the Jurassic. The template was so successful that evolution kept returning to it, refining it, scaling it, and sending it out into new environments to dominate once again. We are left, then, with a portrait of an animal of extraordinary complexity. Not the movie monster of popular imagination, a mindless, roaring engine of destruction, but a sophisticated, physiologically advanced, sensory-rich predator operating at the very limits of what Jurassic biology could produce. A creature that suffered, adapted, hunted with strategy and patience, grew with explosive speed, and ultimately left its mark on every major landmass of its era. The Allosaurus was, by any reasonable measure, one of the most successful large predators that has ever lived on this planet. To truly understand the hunter, we must walk through its world. Let us return to 152 million years ago. Close your eyes and let the mental image form slowly, like a photograph developing in a chemical bath, detail by detail emerging from the white blankness of the present. The geography of the Earth you are imagining is alien to modern eyes, profoundly disorienting alien, because the planet itself was a different object then, its continents arranged in configurations that would be unrecognizable on any map you have ever studied. The supercontinent of Pangaea, that great unified landmass that had dominated the planet for hundreds of millions of years, had begun its grand dissolution. The rifting forces deep within the mantle, driven by the convective churning of semi-liquid rock under pressures that dwarf human comprehension, had been pulling the continents apart for tens of millions of years already. By 152 million years ago, the split between the northern landmass of Laurasia and the southern landmass of Gondwana was well underway. The nascent Atlantic Ocean was a narrow seaway, or a few hundred kilometers wide at most, its edges fringed with shallow tropical reefs and warm, clear waters of a brilliant turquoise that no living human eye has ever seen. The Tethys Sea, that vast tropical ocean, dominated the eastern hemisphere. The Pacific, older and deeper, wrapped around the other side of the globe with its customary indifference to the geological dramas unfolding at its margins. In North America, the tectonic and climatic situation was creating a specific, extraordinary environment. The Sundance Sea, a shallow, warm, epicontinental seaway connected to the Arctic Ocean, had periodically flooded the interior of the continent from the north, retreating and advancing in slow geological pulses dictated by the complex interplay of sea level change and regional subsidence. By the time of our story, the Sundance Sea was retreating northward for the last time, draining away from the interior basin and leaving behind the sediments that would eventually form the lower layers of the Morrison Formation. As the sea withdrew, it left the interior open to the weather. To the west, a chain of volcanic mountains, the ancestral precursors to what would eventually become the Sierra Nevada, was rising along the western margin of the continent, driven by the subduction of the oceanic plate beneath the continental edge. These mountains created a significant orographic barrier, capturing moisture from the warm Pacific and depositing it on their western slopes while casting a long-range shadow over the interior basin to the east. The result was a continental interior that was semi-arid, subject to intense seasonal swings between wet and dry conditions, broadly analogous in structure, if not in flora and fauna, to the modern monsoon-influenced savannas of East Africa or the seasonal floodplains of northern Australia. This interior basin, the Morrison landscape, was not a monotonous flatness. It was a varied terrain of floodplains, threaded by broad, seasonally shifting river systems, interrupted by low escarpments of older rock, punctuated by temporary lakes and extensive wetlands during the wet season, and reduced to a sun-baked expanse of cracked red and grey clay during the long, brutal dry seasons. The soil, where it was exposed in the dried riverbeds and on the crests of low ridges, ranged in colour from the deep brick red of iron-rich oxidized sediments to the pale cream of calcium carbonate-enriched calcretes and the dark grey of organic-rich mudstones deposited in quiet backwater swamps. It was a landscape painted in the palette of aridity and ancient water. The atmosphere of this world was profoundly different from the one we breathe today. Atmospheric carbon dioxide levels in the Late Jurassic are estimated to have been approximately 4 to 6 times higher than pre-industrial levels, placing them in the range of 1,900 to 2,000 parts per million, compared to the roughly 280 parts per million of the pre-industrial modern era. This elevated CO2 sustained a greenhouse effect that kept global mean temperatures approximately 3 to 5 degrees Celsius warmer than the 20th century baseline, with polar regions significantly more temperate. There were no permanent polar ice caps. The sea levels, freed from the enormous volumes of water that would eventually be locked into the polar ice sheets of the Pleistocene, stood approximately 150 to 170 meters higher than they do today. The shallow continental shelves of the world were submerged. The continental interiors were warm. The air itself would have felt heavier, richer with humidity during the wet season, thick with the volatile chemical compounds released by the vast forests of Araucarian conifers and the dense ground covers of ferns and horsetails. These plants, Araucaria, the great columnar conifers that still survive today in Chile and Australia, Sequoia, the ancestors of the coastal redwoods, Ginkgo biloba, the living fossil whose distinctive fan-shaped leaf you can still collect from city pavements today, dominated the vegetation. They were immense structures. Individual Araucaria trees in the Morrison environment may have reached heights of 30 to 40 meters, their resinous canopies forming a dense, dark ceiling above the forest floor. The scent of pine resin was pervasive, a clean, sharp note underlying the heavier, warmer smell of damp earth and decomposing vegetation. Below the forest canopy, the ground cover was a thick, unbroken carpet of ferns, not the delicate, shade-loving fronds of modern temperate forests, but robust, chest-high assemblages of tree ferns and ground ferns that blanketed every surface not occupied by the towering conifers. Ye horsetail rushes, equisetum relatives, lined the edges of every stream and standing water body, forming dense, whispering thickets of jointed green stems. There were no grasses, no flowering plants in any significant abundance, no fruit trees, no meadows of wildflowers. The world was green, but it was a green of a different quality, ancient, primordial, darker in hue, denser in texture, without the lightness and variety that the later evolution of the angiosperms would eventually bring. And there are giants everywhere. This is the golden age of the sauropods, and to use that word, golden age, is not hyperbole. Looking across the Morrison floodplain on a clear morning in the wet season when the rivers are running full and the fern fields are impossibly green and the enormous conifers are dripping with the previous night's rain, you would see them in every direction. A herd of Diplodocus carnegie is moving along the near riverbank, their enormously elongated necks and tails giving them the appearance of animate suspension bridges, each animal stretching to a total length of 27 meters. Their tails, tapering to a thin, whip-like tip, crack against the air periodically as they communicate with one another, a sound that travels for miles across the quiet floodplain. They are consuming hundreds of kilograms of low-growing ferns and soft vegetation each day, their peg-like teeth raking the stems from the ground in wide, sweeping motions. Further along the forest margin, the silhouette of Brachiosaurus altithorax rises above the canopy like a living tower. It is 13 meters tall at the shoulder, perhaps higher with its neck raised. And it weighs approximately 56 tons, comparable in mass to a Boeing 737 commercial aircraft. Its front legs are longer than its rear legs, giving it a permanently upward slanting posture that positions the base of its neck high above the ground and allows it to browse in the uppermost canopy zones, exploiting the foliage that no other herbivore can reach. Its heart is an organ of almost incomprehensible power, a muscular pump the size of a small car, beating perhaps 20 times per minute, each contraction pushing blood up an 8-meter neck against the full force of gravity. The cardiovascular engineering that sustains this animal is, by any measure, one of the most extraordinary adaptations in the history of life on Earth. Moving through the lower understory of the forest, the Camarasaurus lentus, the most numerically abundant sauropod of the Morrison Formation, goes about its methodical business of vegetation processing. Where Diplodocus used slender, peg-like teeth to strip soft fronds, Camarasaurus deployed a different tool: robust, spoon-shaped teeth designed to handle coarser, tougher plant material. Its skull was shorter and boxier than those of the diplodocids, its nostrils enormous, positioned high on the snout, their exact function in life still debated. Camarasaurus was not as long as Diplodocus, reaching perhaps 18 meters, nor as tall as Brachiosaurus, but it was enormously abundant, and its bones are among the most common in any Morrison Formation quarry. It occupied the middle ground of the vegetation column, processing the moderate-height shrubs and lower conifer branches that neither the low-sweeping Diplodocus nor the sky-browsing Brachiosaurus consumed. There are others. Apatosaurus lewisi, the animal long misidentified as Brontosaurus in the popular imagination, and now restored to species status under that beloved but historically complex name, was among the most massively built of the Morrison sauropods, its neck shorter and more muscular than Diplodocus, its vertebrae dramatically thickened, its body a barrel of muscle and fat that represented one of the great evolutionary bets on raw mass as a defense strategy. Apatosaurus weighed perhaps 22 to 30 tons, and its tail, equipped with a long, flexible whip section, could deliver blows of devastating force to any predator bold enough to approach its rear quarters. The sound of an Apatosaurus tail crack, produced by the whip-like tip breaking the sound barrier in a motion similar to a bullwhip, would have been a sharp, concussive blast that echoed across the floodplain like a rifle shot. But the herbivores were not only measured in size. Stegosaurus armatus, the great plated herbivore of the Morrison, contributed a different dimension to the ecosystem's complexity. It was 9 meters long, built low and heavy with a small head, a battery of simple leaf-shaped teeth for processing soft vegetation, and a series of alternating bony plates running along its back that may have served in thermoregulation, display, or some combination of both. But the instrument that placed Stegosaurus in the category of actively dangerous prey was the thagomizer, the cluster of 4 bony spikes, each up to 1 meter in length at the end of its tail. Fossil evidence of the thagomizer's effectiveness is preserved in the bones of Allosaurus itself. A caudal vertebra discovered from the Cleveland-Lloyd Quarry bears a puncture wound of exactly the right size, shape, and position to have been inflicted by a Stegosaurus tail spike. Whatever altercation produced that wound, whether it was a predatory encounter gone wrong or a defensive response to an attack, it tells us that Stegosaurus did not simply absorb Allosaurus predation passively. It fought back, and sometimes it drew blood. Competing with Allosaurus at a lower level of the predator hierarchy was Ceratosaurus nasicornis, a theropod of the ceratosaurid lineage, quite distinct from the Allosaurid line in its anatomy and likely in its ecological habits. But Ceratosaurus was smaller, perhaps 5.5 to 6 meters long and considerably lighter than Allosaurus, but it was a more heavily built animal for its size, with robust limbs, a relatively large skull with prominent teeth, and a distinctive nasal horn that gave the species its name. Down its back ran a series of osteoderms, small bony scutes embedded in the skin. an unusual feature in a theropod, possibly functioning in display, thermoregulation, or protection. Ceratosaurus is thought to have occupied a somewhat different ecological niche from Allosaurus, favoring aquatic or semi-aquatic environments and perhaps specializing in fish and small to medium-sized prey, much as modern crocodilians and large river otters partition the semi-aquatic resource space today. The two predators coexisted in the Morrison, but the fossil evidence suggests they did not compete directly. A classic example of ecological partitioning, allowing multiple predator species to coexist in the same broad landscape. At the smallest end of the theropod scale, Ornitholestes hermannii navigated the fern-covered forest floors with the quick, darting energy of a large mongoose. It was a small animal, barely 2 meters long, lightly built, with long legs and a grasping hand, and it occupied the niche of a generalist small predator, pursuing lizards, early mammals, perhaps the eggs of other dinosaurs, and whatever other small prey items the forest floor presented. Its skull was small and its teeth relatively modest, but its agility was extraordinary, and it represents the type of animal that formed the lower tier of the carnivore guild in the Morrison ecosystem. In any world, there are more small hunters than large ones, and Ornitholestes filled that role with apparent success. The mammals of the late Jurassic deserve a specific mention because their presence in this world, though completely insignificant in terms of ecological dominance, is profoundly meaningful to us. They were small. Most were no larger than a modern shrew or mouse. They were nocturnal, or at least crepuscular, hiding from the theropods and pterosaurs during the bright, dangerous hours of the day and emerging into the cooler, darker, safer hours of night to forage. They lived in burrows, under logs, in the dense root masses of the giant ferns. They ate insects, seeds, and each other. They were nearly invisible against the scale of the Jurassic world. And yet, in 152 million years, one of their lineages would produce a species that would excavate the bones of Allosaurus from the rock and wonder at them. The future belonged to the small, warm, frightened creatures hiding in the cycad roots. Above the land, the Jurassic sky was occupied by pterosaurs, flying reptiles of extraordinary diversity, ranging from the small insectivorous forms that fluttered between the conifer branches to larger species with wingspans of several meters that soared on the warm thermals rising from the baked red floodplain. The exact number of pterosaur species flying over the Morrison landscape is still being worked out, but the ecosystem supported a significant aerial fauna that must have been a constant presence in the sky, swooping, gliding, calling to one another with the strange, harsh sounds of reptilian larynges tuned to a world without mammalian competitors. The soundscape of this world would be deeply alien and yet strangely hypnotic. There is no birdsong in the late Jurassic, or very little, the first true birds being present in this era in the form of Archaeopteryx and its contemporaries, but these were not the melodic songbirds of modern woodland dawns. The morning chorus of the Morrison was provided by a different ensemble, the low, basso profundo rumbles of sauropods communicating across the floodplain in frequencies below or at the lower edge of human hearing. The sharp, explosive cracks of whiptails breaking the sound barrier, the shrill calls of pterosaurs overhead, the dry hissing of wind through needle-leaved conifers, and the whisper of fern fronds rubbing against one another in the morning breeze. And underneath all of it, occasionally, the deep, resonant, territorial call of an Allosaurus felt as much in the chest as heard in the ears, a sound that silenced everything else for a long, still moment. The nights of the Morrison were vast and dark in a way that is difficult to imagine from within the light-polluted cocoon of the modern world. Without any artificial illumination across the entire surface of the planet, the night sky above the Jurassic floodplain was a spectacle of unimaginable richness. The Milky Way, a dense, brilliant slash of light across the darkness, the individual stars steady and clear in the dry desert air, the occasional streak of a meteor burning briefly across the heavens. The temperature fell at night, Though not drastically in the warm Jurassic climate, perhaps 10 to 15 degrees Celsius below the day's peak, and the animals of the floodplains stirred in the relative coolness. The mammals emerged from hiding. The small theropods became more active, and in the darkness near the waterholes, the patience of the large predators was given its fullest expression. The rivers of the Morrison were the arteries of the ecosystem. They were not the permanent, year-round rivers of well-watered modern landscapes, but seasonally explosive braided stream systems that could shift their channels dramatically between wet and dry seasons, cutting new paths through the soft sediments, abandoning old channels as oxbow lakes that slowly shrunk and dried in the summer heat. These rivers connected the scattered patches of forest and waterhole, creating corridors along which animals moved, herds followed, and predators waited. The river crossings were points of particular vulnerability for the great sauropod herds, and it is plausible, though unverifiable, that Allosaurus learned to exploit these crossing points, as modern large predators exploit the crossing points of wildebeest migrations in the Serengeti, positioning themselves in the flow of prey. This ecosystem, the Morrison, was a biological factory of immense productivity. Despite the harsh seasons, it supported a biomass density that would stun modern ecologists accustomed to working in less productive environments. The diversity of the sauropod fauna alone, with its carefully partitioned guilds of browsers operating at different heights and with different dental tools, exploiting different parts of the vegetation column without direct competition, represents one of the most sophisticated ecological organizations in the history of terrestrial life. The system was stable, or at least resilient, having maintained its basic structure for 10 million years or more. And at the apex of this vast, intricate, ancient system, the Allosaurus held its throne with absolute authority. Diplodocus ate the low ferns, Brachiosaurus ate the high canopy, Camarasaurus processed the coarse middle, and eating them all, selecting the vulnerable, the young, the injured, the isolated, was the master of the Morrison. So we have the stage and we have the players. The earth beneath our feet is red clay baked hard as iron. The sky above is a pale, washed-out blue, bleached by a sun that has been rising over this landscape for millions of years without respite. The giants move through the ferns. The predator watches. And now, the script of this ancient play reveals a mystery, a paradox that resists easy resolution, a question that, the more you examine it, the more it seems to deepen rather than clarify. Consider the mathematics of predation. An adult Allosaurus weighs approximately 2 tons. A healthy adult Brachiosaurus altithorax weighs over 50 tons. That is a weight ratio of more than 25 to 1. In the modern Serengeti, the richest predator-prey ecosystem on the contemporary Earth, a pride of lions might cooperatively take down a Cape buffalo that outweighs a single lioness by 3 or 4 times, sometimes a little more. But 25 times? That is not an extrapolation of familiar predator-prey dynamics. That is a different category of interaction entirely. That is a solitary human being attempting to bring down a semi-truck with a kitchen knife. That is physics working against biology at every turn. And yet, we know they did it. The proof is not theoretical. It is not speculative. It is written in stone, literally in the permanence of fossilized bone. We have sauropod vertebrae bearing healed bite marks, evidence of wounds inflicted by Allosaurus teeth that the animal survived, wounds that were subsequently remodeled by living bone tissue over months or years, with the precise spacing and morphology of Allosaurus dental rows. We have shed Allosaurus teeth found embedded in the rib cages of herbivores and scattered on the ancient surfaces where feeding episodes occurred. We have Allosaurus bones themselves that bear evidence of damage consistent with the defensive blows of large prey animals, broken ribs, fractured foot bones, damaged vertebrae. This was not a predator that survived by picking off carrion. This was active, dangerous, contested predation on animals that fought back with everything they had. Allosaurus dominated this ecosystem for the extraordinary span of approximately 10 million years, from roughly 155 million years ago to 145 million years ago, the close of the Jurassic period. That duration deserves to be held in the mind for a moment. 10 million years. For context, the entire evolutionary history of the genus Homo, all of our species, all of our ancestors, from the first stone tool users to the architects of the modern world, spans approximately 2 to 3 million years. Our Allosaurus was apex predator of the Morrison ecosystem for 3 times the entire history of our genus. It was not a temporary success. It was a dynasty. But the paradox compounds itself. This dynasty was built on the predation of animals many times larger than itself. How? The hatchet attack theory of Robert Barker offers one answer: slash and bleed, a strategy of attrition rather than instant killing power. But the strategy must have required something more than anatomy. It must have required behavior, possibly social behavior, possibly coordination between individuals. This question, the question of how much intelligence, how much social complexity, how much cooperative cognition the Allosaurus possessed, is the second great mystery that the fossil record poses and only partially answers. Did Allosaurus hunt in groups? Did individual animals develop knowledge of specific prey herds, returning to the same hunting grounds season after season? Did mothers teach their young to hunt? Did they communicate strategies, share information about prey locations, coordinate flank attacks with the precision of a military operation? These questions lead into depths of uncertainty that paleontology, for all its ingenuity, cannot yet fully illuminate. And yet they are questions that cannot be ignored because they speak to the very nature of what Allosaurus was, not just as an anatomical structure, but as a living, thinking, behaving organism embedded in a complex social and ecological world. And then there is the third question, perhaps the most haunting of all. If Allosaurus was so perfectly engineered, so extraordinarily successful, so thoroughly dominant in its ecosystem for so long, why did it vanish? The end of the Jurassic period, 145 million years ago, was not punctuated by the kind of catastrophic, instantaneous extinction event that would later terminate the non-avian dinosaurs at the close of the Cretaceous. There was no asteroid, no sudden winter of dust and darkness. The transition from Jurassic to Cretaceous was a more gradual affair, shifting climates, changing sea levels, the slow reorganization of ecosystems that had been stable for millions of years. And yet, as that transition unfolded, the specific body plan, the specific species, the specific ecological presence of the North American Allosaurus faded from the record and did not return. Why does an apex predator at the height of its power simply fade away? Does the ecosystem that made it become the trap that ends it? Does specialization, the very quality that drives an animal to the top of the food chain, become the vulnerability that makes it brittle when the world begins to change? These are the questions that the rest of this journey will pursue. Questions about deep time, about adaptation, about the strange and beautiful logic of evolution. Questions whose answers, even when we find them, only deepen the sense of wonder that this ancient creature provokes. But here is where the story gets truly strange. Drive southeast from Price, Utah, through the high desert country where the rock is the color of dried blood and the sky sits hard and blue above the mesas. You will pass through scrubland where nothing seems to live, where the only movement is the occasional hawk riding the thermals above the canyon walls. Turn off the highway onto a track of pale gravel and follow it for a few miles through the silence. And there, in a low depression in the landscape, surrounded by a modest building and a scattering of interpretive signs, you will find the Cleveland-Lloyd Dinosaur Quarry. It does not look, from the outside, like the most important place in the history of predatory dinosaur science, but it is. The quarry was first noted by scientists in the 1920s when the University of Utah began preliminary excavations. By the 1960s, organized scientific campaigns led by the University of Utah and various collaborating institutions had begun systematic extraction of the bone bed. Over the following decades, as the work continued season after season, the true scale of the deposit became apparent. A single patch of ground covering approximately 0.4 hectares, about the size of a large suburban back garden or a modest parking lot, had yielded, by the time serious tallying began, more than 10,000 individual bones. These represented, at minimum, 46 distinct Allosaurus individuals. The number may be higher. Some researchers believe the minimum number of individuals is in the range of 60 or more, depending on how fragmentary specimens are assigned. But it is not the number of bones that makes Cleveland-Lloyd extraordinary. It is the identity of those bones. In any normal ecological context, for every one large predator, an ecosystem must support somewhere between 10 and 100 large herbivores. This is the basic energetic logic of the trophic pyramid, the unavoidable mathematics of food chains. Energy is lost at every level. 100 tons of vegetation supports 10 tons of herbivore, which supports 1 ton of predator. You cannot invert this pyramid. You cannot have more predators than prey. The laws of thermodynamics forbid it, and yet, at Cleveland-Lloyd, the ratio is inverted. Approximately 67% of all bones recovered belong to Allosaurus. The herbivores, Stegosaurus, Camarasaurus, a few other Morrison species, are present only as a minority. Why are there more predators than prey at this site? How did 46 or more Allosaurus die in the same small patch of Utah earth? The question has been debated for more than half a century, and it remains, in the strict scientific sense of the word, unresolved. Several hypotheses have been proposed with varying degrees of support. The most popular and perhaps the most cinematically compelling is the predator trap hypothesis. This idea posits that a large herbivore, perhaps a Camarasaurus or Stegosaurus, became mired in the deep, sticky mud surrounding a drying waterhole. Its distress calls, audible for miles across the floodplain, would have attracted the attention of every Allosaurus in the region. Drawn by the smell of stressed prey and the auditory signals of a creature in trouble, one Allosaurus after another would have approached and been trapped in turn, its heavy body sinking into the adhesive mud as it attempted to reach the herbivore. Each trapped Allosaurus would have added its own distress signals to the mix, drawing more. A feedback loop of doom converging on this single point in the landscape. This hypothesis is appealing. It echoes the famous La Brea tar pits of Los Angeles, where a similar mechanism produced bone beds dominated by predators during the Pleistocene. Saber-toothed cats, dire wolves, and lions drawn to trapped prey and themselves becoming trapped. But the Cleveland-Lloyd scenario is more extreme than La Brea, both in the number of animals involved and in the near-total dominance of a single predator species. Critics of the predator trap hypothesis note that the sedimentology of the quarry does not show the kind of dense, viscous mud deposit that a sticky predator trap would require, and that the bones show evidence of being transported and reworked by water, suggesting a more complex depositional history. Other hypotheses invoke drought. In the long, brutal, dry seasons of the Morrison climate, the surface water may have retreated to a very small number of permanent waterholes, drawing animals from enormous distances in acts of desperate aggregation. A poisoned or pathogen-contaminated waterhole, fouled by the accumulated decomposing carcasses of earlier victims or by the naturally occurring toxins produced by algal blooms in stagnant, warm, oxygen-depleted water, could have killed animals in large numbers over an extended period, the bodies accumulating in layers at and around the water's edge. The toxin hypothesis has some support from the sedimentology, which shows repeated deposition episodes consistent with multiple mortality events over time. rather than a single catastrophic death. But none of the hypotheses fully accounts for the overwhelming abundance of Allosaurus relative to everything else. Whatever drew them there, whatever ancient catastrophe or terrible instinct led 46 Allosaurus to the same patch of Utah Earth, it left us the most extraordinary window into their lives that science has ever found. It is a mass grave that speaks, and its whisper tells us that these animals were social, numerous, and prone to dying together, that their world, for all its apparent dominance, contained traps and catastrophes invisible to the living animals walking into them. A reminder that no creature, however perfectly engineered, navigates existence without risk, without loss, without the final, inescapable claim of the Earth on every body that has ever lived. If this story is carrying you somewhere peaceful, feel free to close your eyes. The narration will guide you. And so we descend into the spiral of time. Let us reconstruct the life that led to those bones. Let us breathe air into the lungs of the fossil. Step by careful step, we will walk the full path of the Allosaurus, from the first grey light of a Jurassic morning to the long, slow silence of an extinction that unfolded not in fire and darkness, but in the creeping aridity of a world changing beneath the feet of those who lived in it. It is early morning. The air is cool in the specific temporary way of a semi-arid landscape before the sun reaches full strength, a brief respite from the heat that the animal's body uses efficiently, moving during this window when the thermoregulatory cost of activity is lowest. Mist clings to the valley floor in thin, white tendrils, rising from the river that ran here during last season's rains and now runs lower, slower. We're already beginning its seasonal retreat. The Araucarian conifers stand in dark columns above the mist, their upper crowns catching the first gold of the sunrise while their roots are still in shadow. A herd of Diplodocus is moving through a narrow valley, hemmed in on both sides by walls of red sandstone. There are 11 of them, 2 large adults, 3 subadults of varying sizes, and 6 juveniles, the smallest of which would still weigh several tons. They move with the unhurried, rolling gait of animals, accustomed to covering large distances every day, their enormous necks swaying gently from side to side as they strip ferns and low shrubs in passing sweeps. Their footsteps are felt before they are heard, a rhythmic subsonic drumming transmitted through the ground that the Allosaurus, awaiting in the dense ferny undergrowth at the cliff base 200 meters ahead, detects through its feet and its lower legs long before the first animal rounds the bend of the valley. There are 3 Allosaurus in the ambush. The largest is a female, fully adult, 9.5 meters long, close to 2,300 kilograms. Her crests are worn and chipped from a decade and a half of exactly this work. She knows this valley. She has used this ambush point before. Beside her wait 2 younger animals, a subadult male of about 7 meters and a slightly smaller female. Whether they are her offspring or unrelated opportunists who have learned to follow her success, the fossil record cannot tell us. But they are here, coordinated in space, waiting together. That fact alone suggests a social complexity that exceeds the strictly solitary behavior of most large modern reptiles. The signal is infrasonic, a resonant pulse generated in the enlarged sinus cavities of the skull, felt as a vibration in the ground rather than heard in the air, below the threshold of the Diplodocus herd's awareness. The subadult male shifts his weight forward, the smaller female lowers her head. They have been through this sequence before. The largest Allosaurus bursts from the ferns. The explosion of movement is startling in its suddenness. 2,300 kilograms moving from absolute stillness to a full running gait in under 2 seconds. The enormous hind legs driving in long, powerful strides. The forelimbs tucked tight to the body for aerodynamic efficiency, the tail extended as a counterbalance. She covers the 200 meters to the Diplodocus herd in slightly more than 30 seconds. Time enough for the herd to begin its panicked response, but not enough time for them to organize a coordinated defense or break formation in the narrow valley. She targets the subadult Diplodocus that has been lagging behind the group for the past 2 days, a young male, perhaps 12 meters long and 8 tons, whose gait has been slightly asymmetrical, suggestive of a damaged front leg. She has been watching him. She knows he is the weak point. As she closes the final few meters, her mouth opens to a gape of nearly 80 degrees, the skull flexing at the kinetic joint, a complex interlocking arrangement of bones that allows the snout to rise relative to the lower jaw, increasing the effective gape and bringing more of the serrated tooth surface into contact with the target. The jaw comes down like a hatchet. The impact is into the soft tissue of the Diplodocus's left flank, just ahead of the hip, a zone of dense, vulnerable musculature and major blood vessels. The upper teeth bite deep. Then, using the extraordinary leverage of her neck muscles, she pulls her head back and to the side, tearing rather than crushing, ripping a wound that immediately releases a cascade of bright arterial blood. She disengages. This is critical. She does not hold, does not wrestle, does not attempt to maintain contact with an 8-ton animal that is now thrashing in terror and pain. To hold would be to risk being crushed, thrown, or struck by the desperate lashing of the Diplodocus tail. Instead, she leaps back, moving with surprising agility for her size, and puts 5 meters of space between herself and the wounded animal's defensive radius. The other 2 allosaurs are already in motion. The subadult male darts at the rear legs of the wounded Diplodocus, delivering a shorter, sharper slash to the Achilles tendon region, not deep enough to sever the tendon immediately, but enough to add pain and damage to an already compromised animal. The smaller female makes a high-speed pass at the neck of the nearest adult Diplodocus, a feint, a distraction, forcing the larger animals to turn and face her rather than advancing to protect the subadult. Chaos is the predator's friend. The herd breaks its coherence. The adults scatter toward the far end of the valley. The subadult Diplodocus, bleeding heavily from its flank, he stumbles on its already damaged front leg. What follows is not a quick kill. It is the slow work of attrition that the Allosaurus Anatomy was designed to deliver. Over the next hour, the 3 predators return to the Diplodocus in rotating passes, each time inflicting a new wound and retreating before the prey's desperate defensive movements can connect. The prey animal's blood loss mounts, its movements slow, its vocalizations change from the sharp, high alarm calls of terror to the lower, more rhythmic sounds of exhaustion. And finally, when the Diplodocus can no longer stand, when its enormous body sways and crashes to the earth, the allosaurs close in and the drama is resolved. This scene played out millions of times over 10 million years. It was the engine of natural selection in the Morrison ecosystem. The old, the injured, the unlucky juveniles of the sauropod herds. These were the animals that Allosaurus harvested, generation after generation, pruning the herbivore populations and, in doing so, paradoxically strengthening them. The strongest, fastest, most alert individuals were the ones who survived to reproduce. The thagomizer spikes of Stegosaurus grew more elaborate because the individuals with inadequate defenses were eaten. The neck muscles of Diplodocus grew stronger because the individuals who escaped the hatchet attack were the ones who lived to pass on their genes. The predator and the prey were locked in an evolutionary arms race of breathtaking intricacy, each driving the other toward greater sophistication over millions of years. But the story does not end with the kill. The reality of Big Al's bones reminds us that life for an Allosaurus was paid for in constant physical cost. Big Al, MOR 693, discovered in 1991, our most complete and most revealing specimen, did not die in a glorious hunt. He died young, before he reached full adult size, killed not by a more powerful predator or a superior rival, but by the accumulation of injuries that the hunting life inevitably inflicts. His left foot was the center of his downfall. The metatarsal bone, one of the long bones connecting the ankle to the toes, had sustained an infection that had progressed to chronic osteomyelitis. The bone tissue surrounding the infection was a chaotic, cauliflower-textured mass of reactive bone, while the body's attempt to wall off the bacterial invasion that had entered through a wound, most likely a puncture from a prey animal's horn, spike, or claw that had been insufficiently cleaned and had become colonized. The infection would have been excruciatingly painful, reducing the efficiency of his gait and making the explosive movements required for a successful hunt increasingly difficult. His ribs told another story. At least 3 separate rib fractures were visible in the fossil, each at a different stage of healing, suggesting that the injuries had occurred at different points in his life rather than in a single catastrophic event. Rib fractures in a large theropod are consistent with the kinds of forces that hunting large prey imposes. The impact of collision with a struggling multi-ton animal, or the shock of a near miss from a sauropod tail strike, the compressive stress of a wrestling fall. Big Al had been hit hard multiple times, and he had recovered each time. Until he could not recover anymore. What does Big Al tell us about Allosaurus physiology beyond its injuries? The speed of his healing is significant. The infection in his foot, the knitted ribs, the remodeled bone damage, all of these required an immune system and a bone repair mechanism of considerable power. Cold-blooded reptiles healed slowly, especially at lower temperatures. The rate and quality of healing in Big Al is more consistent with an animal running a high, stable body temperature, with the metabolic resources to sustain rapid cellular repair. This supports the picture from bone histology. Allosaurus was not a cold-blooded reptile. It was a metabolic dynamo, and the energy demands of a metabolic dynamo are immense. A fully adult Allosaurus at 2,000 kilograms, maintaining a body temperature similar to a modern large bird or mammal, would require something in the region of 20 to 40 kilograms of meat per day to sustain its resting metabolic needs, more during periods of intense activity. A single large Diplodocus kill, an animal of perhaps 8 to 10 tons, would provide enough food to sustain an adult Allosaurus for many weeks, perhaps longer if the carcass was consumed efficiently and shared minimally. But the hunting success rate, the fraction of attempted hunts that resulted in a successful kill, was almost certainly low, as it is for modern large predators. Lions succeed in roughly 1 in 4 or 5 hunt attempts. Allosaurus were hunting prey far larger and more capable of inflicting injury in defense, may have had a significantly lower success rate. The life of Allosaurus was a constant economic balancing act between the energy cost of hunting and the energy yield of a successful kill. The question of whether Allosaurus hunted cooperatively, whether it possessed the cognitive and social infrastructure for coordinated group predation, is one of the most debated in Jurassic paleontology, and one of the most consequential. It matters not just as a question of behavior, but as a question of what kind of mind Allosaurus possessed, what kind of social relationships it formed, what kind of world it inhabited internally as well as externally. The evidence from Cleveland-Lloyd, while not conclusive, is at minimum suggestive. The aggregation of so many individuals at a single site, regardless of the mechanism that killed them, implies that Allosaurus were not uniformly and rigidly solitary animals. Modern large predators that are predominantly solitary, tigers, for instance, or most large constrictor snakes, do not produce aggregation bone beds of this kind. The mere fact that 46 or more Allosaurus were in the same area at the same time implies some degree of tolerance for conspecifics at minimum, and possibly a more structured social dynamic. Comparative biology offers cautious parallels. Modern Komodo dragons and crocodilians, despite their reputations as purely solitary hunters, have been observed tolerating conspecifics at carcasses, sharing feeding sites, and aggregating at scarce resources. They do not coordinate hunts with wolf-like precision, chunk, but neither are they the rigidly solitary animals they were once assumed to be. These examples suggest that a large, intelligent predatory reptile capable of social tolerance and cooperative feeding is not a biological impossibility, and they make the Allosaurid evidence at Cleveland-Lloyd harder to dismiss. The brain of Allosaurus, as revealed by endocast analysis, was not large by mammalian standards. Its encephalization quotient was broadly comparable to a modern crocodilian, but encephalization quotient is a blunt instrument measuring quantity of neural tissue rather than functional organization. Modern crocodilian cognition has surprised researchers with its capacity for learning, problem-solving, and individual recognition. An Allosaurus with a crocodilian-grade brain was not cognitively simple. So it was an animal capable of mapping territory, recognizing individual prey, anticipating seasonal movements, and potentially communicating information to conspecifics through chemical and acoustic channels. The enlarged olfactory bulbs deserve special attention here. The chemical world accessible to an Allosaurus through its nasal system was vastly richer and more information-dense than anything we experience. A modern bloodhound can identify a human scent trail days old and follow it for miles. For Allosaurus with olfactory bulbs proportionally larger than a bloodhound's, the chemical landscape of the Morrison would have been a map of extraordinary detail. Individual animals identifiable by scent, their health status readable from stress hormones and metabolic byproducts in their exhalations. Their location in the landscape traceable through scent trails on the vegetation and ground. In this chemical world, two Allosaurus in proximity to one another would have been exchanging an enormous amount of information about identity, reproductive status, health, and dominance, without making a single sound. Perhaps the most honest position is this. Allosaurus probably occupied a middle ground between the rigid solitary behavior of a modern tiger and the highly coordinated pack hunting of a wolf or African wild dog. It likely tolerated conspecifics more readily than popular imagery suggests, particularly outside the breeding season. It may have engaged in loose opportunistic group hunting, with multiple individuals converging on the same prey and benefiting from the collective confusion and injury their combined attacks produced, without necessarily coordinating their actions with the strategic precision of a wolf pack. And it may, in some circumstances, have engaged in behavior that approached true cooperative hunting, particularly when tackling the largest sauropods, where the energetic benefit of shared effort would have been enormous. The fossil record cannot prove this, but it cannot rule it out either. Over the next 5 million years after the height of the Allosaurus dynasty, advancing through time from approximately 150 million years ago toward the great transition that awaited at 145 million years ago, the world that had sustained the Morrison ecosystem began, slowly and relentlessly, to transform. The changes were not dramatic in the way that asteroid impacts or supervolcanic eruptions are dramatic. There was no single event, no identifiable catastrophe, no line in the rock where everything above is different from everything below. Instead, the changes accumulated gradually over millions of years in the way that all the most profound and permanent changes on Earth tend to accumulate. A degree of temperature here, a meter of sea level there, a shift in the seasonal rainfall distribution that persisted across 1,000 generations of animals until the vegetation responded, and the herbivore communities responded to the vegetation, and the predator communities responded to the herbivores, and the whole intricate web of ecological relationships stretched and strained, and, eventually, in some of its threads, broke. The primary driver of change was tectonic. The continued drift of the North American continent, the progressive closure of the Sundance Sea as sea levels fell slightly in the latest Jurassic, and the continued development of the mountain ranges to the west all contributed to a gradual aridification of the Morrison interior. The wet seasons became shorter, the dry seasons became longer and more severe. The rivers ran lower and retreated to permanent channels only in the deepest valleys. The great conifer forests that had provided dense cover for Allosaurus ambushes and browsing for the tall sauropods began to thin, the spacing between trees increasing as the soil moisture decreased. The fern ground cover, so luxuriant during the wet season, was reduced to sparse patches surviving in the shade of remaining trees and along the dwindling watercourses. This would mean that the prey base of the Allosaurus ecosystem was under pressure. The diplodocid sauropods, the great long-necked browsing giants that formed the bulk of Allosaurus prey, were specialists. Their anatomy, their dental equipment, their social behaviors had all been refined over millions of years to exploit the specific vegetation of the Morrison. As that vegetation changed, the diplodocid specialists found themselves increasingly ill-adapted. Their populations may have declined gradually, the herds shrinking season by season, the breeding density dropping below the threshold needed to sustain stable social structures, the old and the injured dying faster than the young could replace them. For the Allosaurus, a thinning prey base meant harder times. The kills became less frequent. The energy available to raise offspring decreased. Juvenile Allosaurus, dependent on the kills of adults for food in their early months and on the availability of sufficient prey for their own first independent hunts, faced increasingly harsh conditions. The population began a slow decline, not a cliff edge collapse, but a gradual deflation, like the slow leak of air from an object with a tiny invisible puncture. At the same time, new competitors were emerging in other parts of the world and beginning to invade from the south and east. The early Cretaceous world was not a static tableau, waiting for the Morrison ecosystem to decide its fate. It was a dynamic, evolving mosaic of ecosystems in contact and competition through the intermittent land connections created by shifting sea levels. New lineages of theropods, smaller, faster, more cognitively flexible, were beginning to radiate. The ancestors of the dromaeosaurs were diversifying. The tyrannosaur lineage, still small in this era but already exhibiting the enlarged brain and enhanced sensory systems that would eventually make its descendants the dominant predators of the Northern Hemisphere, was beginning its long evolutionary journey toward supremacy. But the story doesn't end there. The story never ends cleanly. In nature, as in human history, the end of one chapter is always the beginning of another. The disappearance of Allosaurus from the North American fossil record at the close of the Jurassic was a local extinction, not a global one. The Allosaurid lineage, the broader evolutionary tree of which Allosaurus was only one branch, did not die at 145 million years ago. It persisted, and in the southern hemisphere, it flourished beyond anything the Morrison animals had achieved. The key evolutionary transition occurred in the separation of Laurasia and Gondwana. As the northern and southern continents divided during the late Jurassic and early Cretaceous, the Allosaurid populations that had been present on both landmasses were separated by the widening seas. On Laurasia, the northern Allosaurids faced the increasing competition of the Tyrannosaur lineage and the changing climate. On Gondwana, the great southern supercontinent encompassing what would eventually become South America, Africa, Antarctica, Australia, and the Indian subcontinent, the Allosaurids faced no such challenge. They had the southern hemisphere to themselves, and they filled it. Over the next 50 million years, now the Gondwanan Allosaurids turns out evolved into the Carcharodontosauridae, the shark-toothed lizards, a family of predatory theropods that would ultimately produce the largest terrestrial carnivores in the history of Earth, surpassing even Tyrannosaurus rex in raw body length, if not in the bone-crushing specialization that made T-Rex unique. Carcharodontosaurus saharicus, discovered in the Cenomanian age rock formations of North Africa and described in modern form by Paul Sereno in 1996, reached estimated lengths of 12 to 13 meters and estimated masses of 6,000 to 15,000 kilograms. The upper end of these estimates placing it among the 2 or 3 largest theropods known to science. Its skull alone measured approximately 1.6 meters, its teeth saw-edged and triangular, more like the teeth of a great white shark than the blade-like teeth of its Allosaurus ancestor, hence the name. It inhabited a world of giant sauropods in what is now the Sahara, playing the same ecological role that Allosaurus had played in the Morrison 50 million years earlier, but scaled up to match the even more massive prey of the early Cretaceous African ecosystem. Giganotosaurus carolini, from the Cenomanian of Patagonia, Argentina, described by Rodolfo Coria and Leonardo Salgado in 1995, was of comparable size, perhaps 12.5 meters long, with a skull even longer than Carcharodontosaurus, though proportionally narrower. It hunted Argentinosaurus, a titanosaur sauropod that may have been the largest land animal in the history of the planet, with mass estimates ranging up to 70 or even 80 tons. Giganotosaurus, like Carcharodontosaurus, was an allosaurid predator operating in the tradition established 80 million years earlier by its distant ancestor, an apex predator of extraordinary size, attacking prey many times its own mass in the great sauropod-dominated ecosystems of the southern Cretaceous. Mapusaurus rosei, also from Patagonia, and described by Coria and Curry in 2006, offers the most compelling parallel to Cleveland-Lloyd. Its bone bed from the Huincal Formation contains at least 7 individuals of varying ages, an aggregation strikingly similar in structure. If social tolerance and opportunistic group behavior were present in both the original Allosaurus and its Gondwanan descendants, this may represent a deep inherited tendency in the allosaurid lineage persisting across 50 million years of separate evolution. Alongside these southern giants, the Asian Synraptorids, including Synraptodongi of late Jurassic Xinjiang, confirmed that the allosauroid template was a genuinely global phenomenon, the dominant body plan for large theropod predation across multiple continents and millions of years. What made Allosaurus neurologically unique compared to other theropods of its era? Why, among the various large carnivores of the Morrison Formation, Ceratosaurus, Torvosaurus, the smaller coelurosaurs? Did Allosaurus achieve such extraordinary and enduring dominance? Part of the answer must lie in the specific cognitive and sensory architecture of its brain. The endocast of Allosaurus, the cast of the brain's shape and volume formed by the inner surface of the brain case, recoverable in well-preserved specimens, reveals a brain that, while small by mammalian standards, was specifically organized in ways that maximize the capabilities most critical for large predation. The olfactory system, already noted, was extraordinary. But the cerebellum, the region responsible for coordination, balance, and precise motor control, was also well developed, consistent with the agile, precisely coordinated movement that the hatchet attack hunting strategy required. An animal that needed to sprint at speed, turn abruptly, strike with the top of its skull, and disengage rapidly needed excellent cerebellar function. The endocast suggests it had exactly that. There is also the question of infrasound communication. Several large modern reptiles and birds use infrasound, sound frequencies below the 20 Hz threshold of human hearing, for long-distance communication, where alligators produce infrasonic bellows that cause the water surface near them to dance and ripple. Elephants use infrasound to coordinate the movements of separated family groups over distances of many kilometers. The enlarged sinus cavities in the skull of Allosaurus, the same cavities that produce the skull's distinctive bony crests and ridges, may have functioned as resonating chambers for infrasonic vocal production. If so, Allosaurus could have communicated over distances far greater than any audible call would allow, coordinating movements across a landscape, marking territories, and possibly, in the context of cooperative hunting, signaling the initiation or direction of an attack in ways that the prey animals could not hear. This possibility, if real, would represent a level of social sophistication that would fundamentally revise our image of Allosaurus as a primarily solitary predator. It is a hypothesis, not a conclusion. But it is a hypothesis grounded in solid comparative biology and plausible given the anatomical evidence. And it is the kind of hypothesis that, once raised, it becomes impossible to entirely dismiss when looking at the great predator's skull with its crests and its cavities and its suggestion of a secret inner life. The question of Allosaurus metabolic physiology deserves its own sustained exploration because it is not yet fully resolved and because its implications are profound. The traditional view of non-avian dinosaurs as cold-blooded, ectothermic reptiles was dismantled in the late 20th century by a combination of anatomical, isotopic, and histological evidence, and the new consensus places most large theropods, including Allosaurus, somewhere on a spectrum from fully endothermic to mesothermic, maintaining elevated body temperatures through a combination of internally generated heat and the thermal mass of a large body, but not necessarily with the precise thermoregulatory control of a modern mammal or bird. Beyond bone histology, stable oxygen isotope ratios preserved in fossil tooth enamel have been applied to Morrison Formation theropods in studies conducted during the 2000s and 2010s. By comparing isotopic signatures in Allosaurus teeth to those of contemporary herbivores, whose body temperatures tracked ambient conditions more closely, researchers found evidence consistent with Allosaurus maintaining a body temperature significantly elevated above the environment, estimated in the range of 36 to 40 degrees Celsius, the range of a modern large mammal. A warm-blooded Allosaurus needed to eat perhaps 10 to 20 times more food than an equivalent cold-blooded animal, but gained the ability to be active in cool morning hours, sustain pursuit longer, recover from injury faster, and compete at any hour of the day or night with prey whose only true defense was their overwhelming size. By 145 million years ago, exactly at the boundary between the Jurassic and Cretaceous periods, the great Morrison ecosystem was unraveling. The evidence is preserved in the rock itself. The sediments of the latest Jurassic in the Morrison region show a shift from the green and grey mudstones and sandstones of a well-watered floodplain to the redder, coarser, more oxidized sediments of an increasingly dry, erosion-dominated landscape. The calcrete horizons, the white calcium carbonate-rich layers that form in soils that dry out seasonally, become more frequent and more developed, signaling longer and more intense dry seasons. The fossil pollen record shows a decline in moisture-loving plants and an increase in desiccation-tolerant forms. The great diplodocid sauropods, Diplodocus, Apatosaurus, Dubarosaurus, are conspicuously absent from the early Cretaceous of North America. Their disappearance from the fossil record coincides with the deterioration of the Morrison ecosystem, strongly suggesting that the loss of their specific habitat drove their local extinction. The titanosaur sauropods that would eventually replace them in the Cretaceous were more broadly adapted, able to tolerate a wider range of vegetation types and drier conditions, but they arrived too late to sustain the specific ecological community that had supported Allosaurus. And so, Allosaurus, at the summit of its power, faced a world that was becoming less and less of what it needed. The prey it had evolved to hunt was disappearing. The terrain was changing. The rivers were narrowing, the forests were thinning, and in the silent, mineral depths of the sediment that was slowly accumulating over the bones of the last Morrison giants, the record of the dynasty was being written for the last time. A solitary Allosaurus stands on a ridge of red rock, watching the evening light drain from a sky that has not changed in character since the Triassic. Below her, the floodplain is quieter than it was 100,000 years ago. The sauropod herds are smaller. The waterhole she has used every dry season for a decade is lower this year than it has ever been. She calls. The sound echoes off the canyon walls and dissipates in the still air without answer. Somewhere, perhaps 100 miles away, the last viable breeding population of her species is also thinning, also aging, also calling into silence. She does not know this. She knows only the immediate world of scent and sound and the slow, deepening hunger. She will not see another wet season. She will lie down in the cracked red mud near the waterhole, and the sediment will begin its slow, patient work. Her bones will be buried. They will wait for a universe of time, for continents to drift, for mountains to rise and erode, for the great mammals to inherit the warming world. And then a small, warm, curious bipedal creature with a pick and a brush will find them and try, with all the tools of science and all the power of imagination, to bring her briefly, impossibly, back to life. Now, let the boundaries of reality soften. Let the rigid lines of the fossil record blur at their edges, like the margins of a map drawn in pencil rather than ink. Set aside, for a little while, or the strict constraints of what we know happened, and allow the mind to wander into the adjacent country of what might have been. This is not a departure from science. It is an extension of it. Some of the most productive ideas in evolutionary biology and paleontology have emerged from the disciplined imagination, from the asking of counterfactual questions that illuminate, by contrast, why the real path unfolded as it did. What if the climate had not shifted at the close of the Jurassic? What if the chain of tectonic events that gradually aridified the Morrison Basin had been delayed by 5 million years, or 10, or 20? What if the Sundance Sea had persisted or re-advanced, providing the interior of North America with the moisture it needed to maintain its great sauropod floodplains? What if the Morrison ecosystem had not slowly unraveled, but had instead stabilized, locking itself into a dynamic but persistent equilibrium? What if the Allosaurus had been given another 50 million years? Let the image form slowly, like dawnlight building over a landscape you have not seen before but somehow recognize. You are standing, still a ghost, still an observer outside the frame of the narrative, on the same red clay floodplain of what is now the American interior. But the date is different. Not 152 million years ago, but 100 million years ago. The middle of the Cretaceous. The age when, in our actual history, the great land predators of the Northern Hemisphere were the ancestors of Tyrannosaurus, still relatively small, still growing, still decades of evolution away from the bone-crushing giants of the late Cretaceous. In this alternate world, there are no tyrannosaurs. The lineage that would have given rise to them was outcompeted early in the Cretaceous by the established and continuously evolving Allosaurid line. Where Allosaurus held the apex predator niche so completely, so efficiently, and for so long, there was simply no ecological space for the tyrannosaur body plan to develop. The selective pressures that drove the tyrannosaurs toward their distinctive specializations, the enormous skull, the reduced forelimbs, the bone-crushing dentition, were absent. The niche was occupied. Evolution, pragmatic and indifferent to aesthetics, did not bother to reinvent what was already working. The plains of this alternate North America are ruled by Allosaurus imperator, the Emperor Allosaurus, a name I give it here in the spirit of the speculation. One name it would never have heard and would never have needed. It is a creature of breathtaking refinement, 15 meters long from snout to the tip of its long flexible tail, and weighing perhaps 4,000 kilograms, significantly larger than its late Jurassic ancestor but proportionally more slender, built for the sustained pursuit, hunting that the increasingly open landscapes of this alternate Cretaceous would have demanded. It has changed in other ways too. The bony crests above its eyes, the lacrimal and prefrontal horns that gave its ancestor such a distinctive, aggressive silhouette, have elaborated into more complex structures, perhaps used in display and sexual selection as much as in the anatomical function of skull strengthening. We imagine them striped with color, bands of deep ochre and muted crimson against a base coat of pale gold, the colors shifting with age and health status, blazing brightest during the breeding season when competition between males is at its most intense. The skin is not smooth, but patterned in small, irregular scales of subtly different sizes, creating a texture like hammered leather, warm to the touch in the morning sun. The legs have lengthened relative to the body, a shift driven by the selective pressure of hunting in more open terrain, where the ability to sustain running speed over longer distances confers advantage over prey that has had 50 million more years of Allosaurus predation to refine its own defenses. The descendants of the Diplodocus, call them Neodiplodocus, the new whiptails, have evolved in response. Their necks have grown armored with osteoderms, bony nodules embedded in the skin that deflect the hatchet blow or at least reduce its penetrative depth. Their tails have become even more powerful whips, capable of delivering bone-breaking blows at the speed of a cracking bullwhip. The sauropods have not become extinct, they have become tougher, and the Allosaurus has become faster, stronger, more persistent in response. This is the arms race in its purest form. Two lineages locked in reciprocal evolutionary pressure, each driving the other toward greater sophistication over 50 million years, neither able to achieve a final permanent advantage. The ecosystem is not a stable tableau. It is a dynamic, evolving combat, as it has always been, as it always will be. Walk through this alternate forest. The vegetation has changed significantly from the late Jurassic Morrison. By 100 million years ago, even in our actual history, the angiosperms, the flowering plants, have begun their extraordinary radiation. In this alternate world, the flowering plants are present and diversifying, but the giant conifers of the Jurassic have not been wholly displaced. Instead, the two floral kingdoms coexist in a mixed landscape of extraordinary richness. Araucaria and sequoias still tower above the canopy, but now their bases are draped in the broad dark green leaves of early magnolias and the tangled stems of primitive climbing plants. The ground is carpeted not just with ferns, but with the first true grasses, still primitive, short and sparse, nothing like the lawn grass of human memory, and with the tiny, jewel-bright flowers of early angiosperms that have not yet learned to be showy, their petals small and simple, but their biochemical attraction for early insect pollinators already perfected. The light in this forest is different from the late Jurassic forest. Broader leaves catch more of the incoming solar radiation and create a more complex, dappled shadow play on the ground below. Shafts of light move through the canopy as the breeze stirs the leaves, illuminating small patches of the forest floor in sudden gold before the shadow closes again. It is a more intimate light than the open, clear light of the conifer-dominated Jurassic forest. It invites the eye inward, into depth, rather than upward into height. In the understory of this alternate forest, the dwarf allosaurs move, and they are the ecological descendants of those juvenile Allosaurus that learned, over tens of millions of years, to exploit the smaller prey items of the understory, the mammals, the lizards, the small ornithopod dinosaurs that were diversifying rapidly in the shelter of the forest, rather than competing with their larger relatives on the open floodplain. Insular dwarfism and niche specialization have produced, over millions of generations, a population of allosaurids no larger than wolves, retaining the fundamental body plan of their ancestors: the three-clawed forelimbs, the forward-oriented eyes, the distinctive head crests, but miniaturized to a scale suited to the prey they pursue. These forest allosaurs are among the most visually spectacular creatures of this alternate world. Their smaller size has freed evolution to invest more in color and pattern, since thermoregulatory constraints are different for a smaller body. Imagine them in iridescent blues and greens, their scales catching the dappled forest light and shifting color as they move through alternating patches of sun and shade. They hunt in loose family groups, a breeding pair with 2 or 3 offspring of different ages, and their calls are complex, varied sequences of sound. Not the deep infrasonic rumbles of their giant relatives, but higher frequency chirps and rasps that bounce between the trees, carrying information about prey location, danger, and identity. that the human ear would register only as an unusual richness to the forest's ambient acoustic texture. By the rivers of this alternate world, something extraordinary has occurred. In the wetland margins where the rivers meet the forest, a lineage of smaller allosaurids has made the transition to a semi-aquatic existence. The first return to the water by a large theropod since the distant days of the semi-aquatic spinosaurs. These river allosaurs, their bodies remodeled by 40 million years of aquatic selection, have flattened tails for swimming, nostrils positioned high on the skull for breathing at the waterline, and denser bones that allow them to sink below the surface rather than floating helplessly. They lie in the shallows of the warm Cretaceous rivers like enormous living logs, their mottled brown-green coloration making them nearly indistinguishable from the vegetation-draped banks. And then, with explosive, terrifying speed, they strike. The nights of this alternate world are a different kind of darkness than the nights of the late Jurassic. The forest canopy is denser, filtering more starlight, so the forest floor is darker. But the darkness is not empty. It is alive with the sounds of the night shift, the calls of the small mammals that have, in this world too, been biding their time in the shadows, waiting for their moment, still nocturnal, still small, still not yet the masters of the world. Though evolution is working on that, slowly, invisibly, in the quiet genetics of 1,000 generations. Somewhere in the high branches, a primitive primate ancestor grips a branch with its grasping hands and watches with large, night-adapted eyes as a forest Allosaurus passes silently below on its way to the waterhole. Our time moves in this world with the same indifference it moves in every world. The continents continue their drift. The mountains continue to rise and erode. The sea levels continue their slow oscillation with the rhythms of the deep climate. The predators and the prey continue their endless arms race, neither ever winning, neither ever losing, both forever changing in response to each other and to the world around them. And the Earth turns beneath the moon, as it has turned for 4.5 billion years, indifferent to the brief dynasties of flesh and bone that flicker across its surface like candle flames in a great dark room. Let this world slow down now. Let the pace of the narration ease, as the pace of a river eases where it broadens and the current finds the flat country. Feel the warmth of the sun on the alternate landscape. Feel the weight of the ancient air, rich with carbon and moisture, pressing gently against you. There is no urgency here. There is no deadline, no appointment, no concern that extends beyond this moment and this place. The great Allosaurus is resting in the shade of a tree whose species has no name in any human language. Its belly full, its breathing slow and deep. Its eyes are half closed, catching the warmth of the filtered light. It is not thinking about the future. It is not remembering the past. It simply is, fully and completely, in the only moment it has ever known. In the immense distance, the low rumble of a sauropod herd crosses the floodplain. A pterosaur glides overhead, a dark shadow crossing the sun for a moment, then gone. The ferns at the river's edge sway in a breath of warm wind, and a small lizard freezes instinctively until the movement passes. The river runs quietly, its brown water carrying the minerals of 1,000 years of erosion toward the distant sea. And over all of it, over the trees and the rivers and the great resting predator and the small frightened lizard and the ancient sky, the silence of the deep past settles like a fine warm dust. This is the gift of imagination applied to deep time. Not the cold mathematics of the fossil record, not the clinical taxonomy of species descriptions, but the warm, living, breathing possibility of what was and what might have been. The Allosaurus did not ask to be remembered. It did not know it could be remembered. It simply lived its 10 million years and gave its bones to the stone. But we remember it, and in remembering it, we are reaching back across an abyss that dwarfs all of human history combined, touching something ancient and real and, in its own way, beautiful. Rest in this world a little longer. There is no need to hurry back. The present will still be there when you return. The world of the 21st century, with its noise and its speed and its endless demands, will wait for you. For now, let the alternate Jurassic hold you gently. Let the warm, resinous air fill your lungs. Let the deep vibrations of the distant sauropod herds resonate in your chest. Let the ancient starlight fall on the red clay of a world where the monsters never disappeared and the dragons still rule the floodplains, and the slow river carries the memory of everything that ever lived toward the eternal, indifferent sea. We return now, slowly, gently, know the way a diver ascends from deep water, not rushing toward the surface, but allowing the pressure to equalize, allowing the eyes to readjust to the increasing light, arriving back in the present by gradual degrees rather than sudden emergence. The vision of the Jurassic fades behind us. The warm, alternate world dissolves into the specific darkness of the present moment. We are left, as we began, with the bones. The stone. The profound, unhurried silence of deep time pressing gently against the thin membrane of the present. Let us think for a long moment about what a fossil actually is, not in the technical sense that a paleontologist means when they use the word, but in the philosophical sense, the sense that matters at this hour, in this state of mind, at this particular point in the long, strange story of life on Earth. A fossil is a miracle of probability so extreme that it barely makes statistical sense. For any individual organism, any single Allosaurus that ever breathed and hunted and rested and died in the late Jurassic of North America, to be preserved at all, a near-infinite series of contingencies must align perfectly. The animal must die in a location where burial is possible, near a river, a lake margin, a floodplain subject to rapid sediment deposition, rather than dying in an upland area where erosion would scatter and destroy the remains before any burial could occur. The burial must happen quickly, within days or weeks of death, before scavenging, bacterial decomposition, and physical weathering reduce the skeleton to scattered, unrecognizable fragments. The chemistry of the enclosing sediment must be precisely right, sufficiently rich in silica, calcium phosphate, iron, or other minerals that can gradually replace the organic matter of the original bone in a process called permineralization, without so much acid that the bone dissolves entirely, and without the chemical environment that would simply accelerate decay. Then the time must pass. Hundreds of millions of years of time, during which the enclosing rock must not be subducted into the mantle and destroyed, must not be subjected to the extreme heat and pressure of deep metamorphism that would erase all fossil evidence, must not be eroded so rapidly that the fossil is exposed and destroyed before a human being is nearby to find it. And finally, after all of this, the rock must be exposed by the slow, yet gentle work of surface erosion at a rate that reveals the fossil gradually rather than all at once, at a time and in a place where a human being with the knowledge to recognize it and the means to recover it happens to be walking past. Every Allosaurus specimen we possess is a winner of an unimaginably long lottery. For every one we have found, thousands of others were buried and destroyed in the Jurassic sediments, or were never buried at all, or were fossilized and then eroded away in the silent millennia before human awareness existed to notice them. The fact that we know Allosaurus at all, the fact that we can stand in a museum and look at its reconstructed skeleton and feel the weight of its presence, is a gift, not from any individual or any institution, but from the universe itself. From the particular arrangement of physics and chemistry and geological accident that preserved these specific bones through the specific sequence of events that led, ultimately, to human hands brushing the rock away from ancient bone and recognizing the shape of something that once lived. 152 million years. The number sits on the page with a deceptive simplicity, the way all very large numbers do. It does not feel enormous. It does not feel like anything at all at first. And yet, try to inhabit it. Try to stand inside it and look in both directions. 152 million years ago, when the last living Allosaurus drew its last breath, the universe as we understand it, the stars, the galaxies, the fundamental physical laws, was already more than 13 billion years old. Our solar system had already been burning for approximately 4.3 billion years. The Earth had already witnessed the Cambrian explosion of complex multicellular life. It had already survived the first mass extinction, and the second, and the third, and the fourth. The Permian extinction, 252 million years ago, had wiped out approximately 96% of all marine species and 70% of all terrestrial vertebrate species, the worst catastrophe in the history of complex life. And yet, life had recovered, diversified, and produced the world that the Allosaurus inhabited. Allosaurus lived on the far side of an abyss of time that reduces all of human history to an afterthought. And yet, here is what the mind keeps returning to. They were real as anything that has ever existed on this planet. They were not metaphors. They were not symbols. They were not educational exhibits or cinematic props. They were biological organisms composed of the same cellular machinery, DNA, RNA, proteins, lipid membranes, mitochondria, that underlies all life on Earth. They experience things, not in the way we experience things, not with our language, our self-awareness, our capacity for abstract thought and cultural memory, but in the way that all living things with nervous systems experience things, through sensation, through the immediate, unmediated reality of heat and cold, hunger and satiation, danger and safety, the specific texture of the physical world pressing against the skin and the nose and the ears at every moment of every day. When a young Allosaurus stood in the morning light of a Jurassic sunrise and felt the warmth of the sun beginning to penetrate its skin after the coolness of the night, it was experiencing something real. When Big Al limped on his infected foot through the dried clay of a late-season floodplain, the pain he felt was as genuine as any pain that any organism on this planet has ever felt. When a mother Allosaurus, if they were capable of maternal attachment, which the social complexity hinted at in the fossil record suggests is at least possible, watched her offspring take their first fully independent kills, something was happening in her nervous system. Something that we might call, with all appropriate scientific caution, an emotion. We are, in some sense, eavesdropping on their inner lives across an incomprehensible gulf of time, using the only medium that survived the crossing: stone. The bones are not the animal. They are the least perishable part of the animal, the scaffolding that outlasted everything else. The skin dissolved, the muscles dissolved, the organs dissolved, the nervous system, the eyes, the brain, all dissolved, as every soft tissue of every organism that has ever lived dissolves eventually in the chemistry of decay. What remained was the mineral framework, the calcium phosphate architecture of the skeleton, and from that skeletal architecture, science has reconstructed, with extraordinary ingenuity, extraordinary patience, and an extraordinary willingness to sit with uncertainty, the outlines of a living being. There is something profoundly humbling about this process. The scientists who spent their careers on their knees in the desert sun, brushing rock from bone with the delicacy of surgeons, are engaged in an act of profound respect. They are not merely collecting data. They are doing something that approaches, in its way, the recovery of a lost voice. Each bone they free from the rock is a sentence in a biography that would otherwise remain entirely unwritten. Each measurement, each comparative analysis, each isotopic dating and bone histology section is an act of translation, the translating of stone back into flesh, of mineral back into metabolism, of geology back into biology. And what they have translated, in the case of Allosaurus, is the biography of a creature that held the apex predator niche in one of the richest ecosystems the planet has ever produced for longer than the entire history of our genus. a creature whose evolutionary descendants ruled the southern hemisphere for 50 million years after its own disappearance. A creature that hunted prey 25 times its own mass with a precision and patience that still defies easy explanation. A creature that suffered, recovered, aged, and died in a world so remote from ours in time that the distance between us and it is immeasurably greater than the distance between us and any human civilization in recorded history. What is the right response to this knowledge? The question is worth pausing on, because the easy responses, awe, excitement, with the enthusiast's delight in finding a favorite dinosaur in the fossil record, are not quite enough. They are true, but they are not the whole truth. The whole truth is something quieter, something that takes longer to arrive, something that settles not in the excited part of the mind, but in the deeper, stiller part that operates below language. The whole truth is something like this. We are participants in a story so vast that no single mind can hold all of it at once. We are, in our particular moment, part of the same unfolding process that produced the Allosaurus and the Diplodocus, and the Morrison Formation, and the Bone Wars, and the Cleveland-Lloyd Quarry, and Big Al lying on his side in the Jurassic mud. We are made of the same matter, driven by the same evolutionary principles, subject to the same physical laws. The boundary between us and the Jurassic is a boundary of time only, not of substance, not of law, not of the fundamental stuff of which existence is made. We are the universe examining itself across the full span of its own history, reaching back across 152 million years to touch the bones of a creature it has long since returned to stone, and wondering, quietly, without any expectation of a final answer, what it all means. What the purpose of any of it is. Whether there is a purpose. Whether the question of purpose is even the right question to ask of a universe that has been producing extraordinary things in extraordinary abundance for 13.8 billion years without any visible need for external justification. And perhaps that is the most peaceful thought of all. Not that there is an answer, but that the question is beautiful. Not that the story ends somewhere, but that it is still going. That somewhere, on some planetary surface we have not yet found, in some configuration of carbon and water and energy we have not yet imagined, the same process that produced the Allosaurus is still at work, still producing, still experimenting, still generating the improbable and the extraordinary from the patient accumulation of small changes over deep time. The universe is not finished. The story is not over. The Allosaurus is gone. But the going of Allosaurus is itself part of the story, the part that made way for new chapters, new experiments, new forms of life that could not have existed while the old forms still occupied the stage. And one of those forms, in one of those new chapters, he eventually produced a creature capable of lying quietly in the dark and wondering about Allosaurus, capable of feeling the weight of 152 million years pressing gently against the present moment, capable of experiencing something that functions very much like gratitude. Gratitude for the bones in the rock, for the scientists who found them, for the deep time that preserved them, for the specific and improbable accident of existence that allows this moment of wondering to occur at all. Let the wondering be enough. Let it be its own destination. Let the weight of deep time settle around you now, like the slow accumulation of sediment, gentle and warm and unhurried, the way all things that last are built, not in dramatic gestures, but in the quiet deposition of moment upon moment upon moment, each one thin as a page. Do all of them together, constituting the great silent book of the earth. Somewhere beneath the red desert of Utah, in the rock formations that were once a Jurassic floodplain, the bones of Allosaurus still lie undiscovered, waiting with the patience of stone for the moment of their finding. The earth holds them carefully as it has held them for 145 million years, turning slowly through its orbit, carrying its cargo of ancient life through the cold dark of space. indifferent to the smallness of the creatures on its surface, and yet, in its chemistry and its geology, the faithful custodian of every life that has ever lived upon it. The story has no final page. The last sentence has not yet been written. And in the long, quiet meantime, the ancient world rests beneath the present one, warm, dark, still. And the bones dream on. And the deep time holds everything gently, forever in the dark. And whenever you're ready to explore another world, we'll be here.